When 6-year-old Michelle Dorr suddenly vanished from her father's home, she became the focus of an intense and desperate search by investigators and volunteers. But no one could have predicted the prolonged nightmare that was about to unfold. I'm Brian Dennehy, and this is Arrest and Trial.
Corporal Michael L. Garvey of the Montgomery County, Maryland Department of Police was assigned the case.
On May 31st, 1986, Carl Dorr reported to the Montgomery County Police that his 6-year-old daughter, Michelle Dorr, was missing from the residence that he was living in on Sudbury Road in Silver Spring.
Mr. Dorr, when was the last time you saw your daughter?
Carl Dorr claimed he had last seen his daughter sometime around 2 p.m. that afternoon, but he wasn't exactly sure of the time.
Carl Dorr's inability to pinpoint exactly when he had last seen his daughter troubled Corporal Garvey. In a race against time, teams of officers scoured the neighborhood looking for the missing 6-year-old.
Michelle! No!
We searched all the neighborhoods, the backyards, the woods all around, and she was gone. We couldn't find a trace of her.
As the search intensified, investigators interviewed people from around the area, including a neighborhood gardener.
Yeah, I saw a little girl.
She look anything like this?
Not really.
Ma'am, have you seen this little girl, Michelle Dorr?
No. Have you checked with the Clark family?
And during this look into the neighborhood, we came across a gentleman by the name of Haddon Clark that lived 2 houses down from where Michelle disappeared from.
Hayden Clark was a 34-year-old pastry chef who neighbors reported as having suffered from mental illness.
When I first met Haddon Clark and interviewed him, just his appearance, how he talked, Mr. Clark, he had some bizarre behaviors, and he just put him right into the inner circle of possibly being a suspect.
Where were you on the 31st?
Corporal Garvey asked Haddon Clark to come to the station for questioning.
I was at work most of the day, yeah.
Haddon Clark said that he had clocked into work, and he set the time around 2 o'clock.
When's the last time you saw Michelle?
Then I targeted in on the disappearance of Michelle Dorr.
Did you do anything to her?
He became very visibly upset. He began rocking back and forth, putting his face in his hands. And I tried to show him the picture of Michelle Dorr. I held it in my hand. He wouldn't look at it.
I don't know. I want to talk to my psychiatrist.
So we went and actually got a hold of his psychiatrist. She talked to Haddon Clark, and he got off the phone. He said he wouldn't speak to us anymore.
Investigators checked Clark's time card and confirmed his alibi.
And the time card would indicate that he was at work before she disappeared.
Carl, let's go over this one last time. The last time you saw Michelle, she was in the swimming pool. After that, the accounting for your time just simply doesn't make sense.
Corporal Garvey returned his focus to Carl Dorr and learned that he was in the middle of a bitter divorce with his wife, Dorothy.
I'm not sure.
I had many conversations with Dorothy Dorr, and she definitely thought that Carl had done something, whether accidentally or deliberately, to cause the disappearance of her daughter.
After months of intensive questioning, Dorr made a startling confession.
We would get into some real heated debates, and he would say, okay, I killed her, and this is what I did. Isn't that what you want to hear? And I'd say, no, Carl, I really want to hear the truth.
Are you sure you're telling the truth?
I did it! I did it!
At least 5 different times, Carl Dorr told me that he had been responsible for her disappearance, that he had killed her, that the devil had taken her, and just different bizarre things.
I killed her, and then I hit her in a crawl space underneath the house.
He would say things, and we would check it. It just never made any sense. We had nothing, no good, solid, positive leads, and just never came up with a trace of her anywhere. It was unfortunate, but it's just, it was part of the business, what we were doing. Carl Dorr was hospitalized for some mental problems. I think it was just back then how he was dealing with the grief. It's like Carl Dorr's world crashed in on him. He couldn't handle it.
Although investigators no longer believed that Carl Dorr was responsible for his daughter's disappearance, they steadfastly refused to forget the case of Michelle Dorr.
Despite conducting dozens of interviews and running down every possible lead, investigators were no closer to solving the disappearance of Michelle Dore than they were on the day she vanished from her father's home. As months turned into years, all hope of finding Michelle faded. And then in 1992, the unexplained disappearance of a young woman resulted in an unexpected break in the case.
On October 19th, Laura Hoadling, a 23-year-old Harvard graduate, was reported missing from her Bethesda, Maryland home. Montgomery County Police Detective Ed Tarney was brought into the case and contacted the missing woman's mother.
When Mrs. Hoadling, who was away for a week, returned home, she found some things in Laura's bedroom that just weren't right. There was a strange pillow in there, bottom mattress cover was not on the bed, and it was just totally out of character for Laura.
Suspecting foul play, Tarney brought in a crime scene investigator.
We went to the Hoadling home with our forensic chemist and used the chemical luminol on the bed in Laura's bedroom. We discovered that there had been some massive bleeding that had taken place. At that point, we realized that we were possibly looking at a homicide. Would you tell me what goes on around your home on a daily, weekly basis?
Detective Tarney interviewed Laura's mother, Penny, and asked her about any individuals close to the family.
Your gardener. We discovered through the investigation that the family gardener was a character named Haddon Clark. Does he interact with Laura? We also learned that Laura was not comfortable with Haddon Clark and was actually afraid of him.
The name Haddon Clark was hauntingly familiar to investigators. 6 years earlier, Clark had been questioned at length about the unsolved disappearance of 6-year-old Michelle Dore. Detective Tarney tracked down Clark and questioned him about Laura Hoadling.
Detective Tarney.
Yeah.
How are you doing? We need your help. I walked up to Haddon Clark and asked him if he knew anything about Laura, explained that she was missing.
I'm scared.
We need your help to find Laura. You know Laura's missing?
Oh, God!
At that time, Haddon fell down to one knee and began to cry and said, "Oh, God, I just want to die."
Although Tarney didn't have enough to arrest him, Haddon Clark was now the primary suspect in Laura Hoadling's disappearance.
On November 6th, a pillowcase that had been found in a nearby woods that actually matched up to the pillows on Laura's bed had a fingerprint on it. Our crime lab discovered in blood a fingerprint which matched Haddon Clark.
Haddon Clark was charged with the murder of Laura Hoadling and taken to the Montgomery County Detention Center.
During the months between the arrest and the trial, we continued to gather evidence. One of the pieces of evidence was a wig fiber, which was found in Laura Hoadling's hairbrush. We also found entries in his checkbook for a storage bin.
Investigators executed a search warrant on Clark's storage bin and made a startling discovery.
Haddon Clark had numerous wigs, and in fact, he was a cross-dresser. He had a lot of items of ladies' clothing in there. We were able to match up the wig fiber from one of his wigs recovered from the hairbrush.
With the overwhelming evidence against him, Haddon Clark agreed to show investigators where Laura Hoadling was buried.
Haddon Clark had a campsite not far from where Laura Hoadling lived. It so happened that he buried her body just across the highway where he could actually see where she was buried.
Haddon Clark pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. But Detective Tarney still had unfinished business with Clark. The investigator was convinced that the deranged gardener was responsible for the disappearance of 9-year-old Michelle Dore nearly a decade earlier.
Carl, we need to sit down and have a long talk about Michelle's disappearance.
To solve the case, Tarney knew he would have to reopen old wounds.
We're sure that he had something to do with Michelle's disappearance.
I just can't go.
One of the big hurdles was to gain the confidence of Carl Dorr. We had to gain his trust, re-interview him. What I learned from those interviews was that every time in 1986 that Carl Dorr gave a time that he last saw his daughter, it was preceded with an about, an approximately, and it just became obvious that Carl Dorr was not watching the clock that day.
If Carl Dorr was mistaken about the time he had last seen Michelle, then Haddon Clark's time card was no longer an alibi. After reopening the investigation of Michelle Dorr's disappearance, detectives received a call from a jailhouse informant.
Sir, you were a cell buddy with Haddon Clark?
Yeah.
He had
Told me he did it.
gained Haddon Clark's trust, and Haddon Clark confessed that he did in fact murder Michelle Dorr. What did he say he did?
He slashed her with a knife.
In his brother's house in the bedroom. We went to that bedroom, and again with the assistance of our forensic chemist, we used the chemical luminol, and we found traces of suspected blood on that bedroom floor. It was a hardwood floor.
Looks like we're going to have to take this whole floor out.
We took the entire bedroom floor out, removed it to the crime lab, and we retrieved approximately 80 samples of suspected blood. At that point, I got a warrant for Haddon Clark, and I charged him with the murder of Michelle Dorr.
But despite Haddon Clark's arrest, the mystery surrounding Michelle Dorr's disappearance was far from over.
Despite an earlier jailhouse confession to the murder of Michelle Dorr, Haddon Clark now steadfastly proclaimed his innocence. The Montgomery County District Attorney's Office faced the daunting task of prosecuting a nearly 14-year-old murder without the body of the victim.
The responsibility of prosecuting Haddon Clark was given to Assistant State's Attorneys Jim Trusty and Debbie Dwyer.
The fact that there was no body, the fact that there were no witnesses, and the fact that there was really no motive that we could put our finger on as to why a man would kill a 6-year-old girl were obstacles that faced us throughout this trial.
Mr. Clark is a person who physically and verbally comes off as a bit of a strange fellow, as a neighborhood oddball.
I guess I would characterize his demeanor as sometimes very sullen, sometimes very animated. There were times when Haddon could barely stay awake during the trial.
The most striking piece of physical evidence presented during the trial was hardwood flooring removed from the crime scene.
When we brought that floorboard into the courtroom, the forensic chemist had marked by colored tape all of the areas where she had found human blood on that floorboard. You could see that almost the entire room was covered with blood, and you could see how the blood had been moved by the wiping and the cleaning by Haddon Clark.
Although Carl Dorr was unable to remember exactly what time he had last seen his daughter, there was one person who could help set the record straight.
Sir, could you please tell the jury how it was that you happened to be in Haddon Clark's house that afternoon?
In his original statement to police, the neighborhood gardener remembered seeing a young girl, but couldn't identify her from the photograph. Now, years later, he told the courtroom a chilling story.
I went inside to use the telephone.
And what exactly did you see there?
Sure, come on in. Sure.
He remembers Haddon Clark standing in the kitchen with a little dark-haired girl.
Thank you. No problem. Hey.
We believe today that that little dark-haired girl was Michelle Dorr.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
But despite this powerful evidence, the prosecution still had one major obstacle to contend with: Carl Dorr's original multiple confessions.
The defense in this case was that Carl Dorr, Michelle's father, admitted to this killing.
Her murderer is her father, Carl Dorr.
Quite frankly, Jim and I knew that that would be a tremendous obstacle for us as the prosecution, to try to overcome the fact that Carl Dorr had admitted to killing Michelle. Not once, not twice, 3 times.
For the murder of his own daughter.
Carl's ex-wife, Dorothy, testified that she no longer believed he was responsible for Michelle's disappearance.
I have no reason to believe that Carl did anything to Michelle.
But convincing the jury would not be easy.
How can you forget that? How can you jurors put that out of your mind when there is no witness, there is no body, there is no murder weapon, there's very little physical evidence to even suggest that Haddon Clark had done this murder?
The jury now had to decide if the truth behind Michelle Dorr's disappearance lay with her tormented father or the demented mind of Haddon Clark. After 13 painfully long years, the jury finally returned with their verdict.
Haddon Clark, you've been found guilty of murder in the 2nd degree.
For the 2nd time in 6 years, Haddon Clark was convicted of 2nd-degree murder and sentenced to an additional 30 years to be served at the Maryland Correctional Institution in Hagerstown, Maryland. For investigator Edward Tarney, the jury's verdict still did not bring closure.
One of the things that kept me going is I wanted this man away. I never really wanted anything more for him than just to be put away where he wasn't going to hurt anybody else. And I always wanted for the family to recover the body so they could bury her and have some place to go visit her.
6 months after the trial, Tarney's wish for the family was answered when Haddon Clark agreed to lead authorities to the body of Michelle Dorr. Using specially trained dogs, volunteers from Massachusetts and Rhode Island worked around the clock to find her remains. When they located her makeshift grave near a highway, the search for Michelle Dorr finally came to an end. More than 14 years after her disappearance, Michelle Dorr was laid to rest in a cemetery in Washington, D.C. While the pain of this tragedy will always haunt the Dorr family, having the chance to bid a final farewell has, in a small way, helped ease their suffering.
Based on evidence collected during their investigation, authorities believe that Haddon Clark may be responsible for several other unexplained deaths dating back to 1974. But without Clark's cooperation, these murders may never be solved.
The holiday romance from hell at 9 in all new Paradise.